The smell of smoke reaches her before the screaming stops. Matilda is 31 years old, queen of the northern reaches, wife of King Oswulf, mother of 3 children who are somewhere in the chaos outside these walls. She stands in the great hall of her burning palace, wearing a gown that was meant for a feast celebrating her husband's victory, watching through a shattered window as everything she has known collapses into ash and blood. The battle lasted 3 hours. It was supposed to last 3 days. Her husband's army, 3,000 men who had never lost a major engagement, who had held this coastline against raiders for a decade, broke in the first hour of fighting. Not because the Northmen outnumbered them, though they did. Not because the Northmen had better weapons, though in some ways they did, but because the Northmen fought with something Matilda's people did not have, a complete absence of the fear that makes men hesitate. She watched from the tower as her husband's cavalry charged and was swallowed. She watched the shield wall form and collapse. She watched Oswulf himself, recognizable by his golden armor, surrounded and pulled from his horse, like a stag brought down by wolves. What they did to him while he was still alive, she saw only fragments of through the smoke, enough to understand, enough to know that death came slowly when the Northmen wanted it to. Now, the great hall is filling with smoke, and the doors are shuddering under the impact of axes, and Matilda stands motionless in the center of the room because there is nowhere to go. The secret passage her husband had built for exactly this situation collapsed when the East Tower fell. The guards who were supposed to protect her are dead in the courtyard. The servants who might have helped her escape fled hours ago. She is alone, unarmed, and wearing a crown that marks her as exactly what the men outside are looking for. The doors splinter. Through the gap she sees faces painted with symbols she does not recognize, eyes that reflect firelight with an intensity that seems inhuman. The first Northman through the door is enormous, half a head taller than any man in her husband's guard, his beard braided with silver rings that catch the light as he moves. He stops when he sees her. His eyes travel from her face to her crown to the rings on her fingers, assessing not her beauty or her terror, but her value. She is not a woman to him. She is a prize, a commodity, a symbol of victory that will be displayed and used and eventually disposed of according to customs she has heard whispered about but never fully believed. Behind him, more men pour into the hall. They do not touch her, not yet. They wait for the large man to speak, to claim, to decide. The hierarchy is clear even through her shock. This man commands, the others follow, and her fate depends entirely on what he determines she is worth. He speaks in a language she does not understand, harsh consonants and rolling vowels that sound like stones grinding together. The men around him laugh at whatever he said. One of them responds, gesturing at her crown. Another makes a motion she cannot interpret, but that makes the others laugh harder. The large man silences them with a look. He approaches her slowly, the way a hunter approaches a trapped animal, confident but alert for unexpected movement. He stops 3 feet away and studies her face with an attention that is somehow worse than violence would be. Drottning, he says. The word is unfamiliar, but its meaning is clear from context. Queen. He reaches out and removes the crown from her head. His hands are surprisingly gentle, almost ceremonial, as if the removal is a ritual rather than a theft. He examines the crown briefly, weighing it, assessing the gold and gems, then hands it to one of his men without looking. Then, he looks at her again, and his expression changes. Something shifts behind his eyes, some calculation completing, some decision being made. Freyha Gefur, he says. Whatever it means, it makes the men around him grow quiet. They look at her differently now, with something that might be fear, or might be reverence, or might be anticipation of something she cannot imagine. The large man takes her arm, his grip firm but not painful, and leads her out of the burning hall into a night lit by the flames of her kingdom's destruction. Around her, she sees women being dragged from buildings, children being sorted into groups, men being executed or bound depending on criteria she cannot determine. She sees her husband's body, or what remains of it, displayed on a pole near the main gate. She does not scream. She does not fight. She has watched enough of this night to understand that screaming and fighting accomplish nothing except hastening whatever comes next. She allows herself to be led toward the harbor, where ships with dragon prows wait in water that reflects fire like liquid metal. She walks past the corpses of everyone she has ever known into a future that exists beyond anything her experience has prepared her for. She is a queen. She will learn what that means to the men who have taken her. She will learn what Vikings really did to captured royalty. And she will wish, many times in the months to come, that she had found a way to die in that burning hall. What you are about to learn has been systematically softened by centuries of scholarship that preferred to focus on Viking exploration and trade rather than Viking conquest and consumption. The sagas that survived were written by descendants who wanted their ancestors remembered as adventurers rather than predators. The archaeological evidence that tells a different story has been interpreted through frameworks designed to minimize what it actually reveals. Tonight, you will learn what the Norse sources themselves document about the treatment of captured royalty, not the sanitized versions that appear in children's books about fierce but honorable warriors. The actual practices, recorded in their own words, preserved in texts that scholars have traditionally translated with strategic omissions. You will learn about the ritual significance of royal captives, why queens and princesses were valued differently than common prisoners, what specific ceremonies awaited women of noble blood. You will learn about the Thrall system that reduced human beings to categories of property, and the special category that existed for captives whose status made them useful for purposes beyond labor. You will learn about the blot, the sacred rituals that required specific types of offerings, and why royal women sometimes fulfilled requirements that animal sacrifice could not satisfy. You will learn about the practice of gifting high-status captives to gods, to jarls, to warriors who had distinguished themselves in battle. You will learn what the skalds meant when they sang of bed slaves of noble blood, what the laws meant when they specified different rules for thralls of royal origin, what the archaeological evidence of female remains in elite Viking graves actually indicates about the women buried there. You will learn why some captured queens were kept alive for decades, while others disappeared within days, and what determined which fate a woman received. You will learn about the children born from these arrangements, the bloodlines that merged conqueror and conquered in ways that the official histories preferred not to examine. Subscribe if you want to understand the reality behind the mythology. Comment below telling me where you are watching from. Because Matilda is being led to a ship right now, her arms still gripped by the man who claimed her, her future being determined by calculations she does not understand. And I am going to tell you exactly what happened to her. But before I reveal what the Vikings did to captured queens, before I explain the system that had been refined over centuries to extract specific value from royal women, I need to take you back. I need to show you how Viking society actually functioned, why they valued certain captives above all others, and what their own sources reveal about the fate of noble women who fell into their hands. Because you cannot understand what happened to Matilda without understanding the men who took her and the culture that shaped them. The Vikings were not a unified people or a single culture. They were a collection of Scandinavian societies, Norse, Danes, Swedes, who shared language, religion, and certain fundamental assumptions about how the world worked. Among these assumptions was one that shaped everything they did, the belief that the universe was governed by fate, that outcomes were determined by forces beyond human control, and that the only appropriate response to this cosmic indifference was to seize what you could while you could seize it. This worldview produced the raids that terrorized coastal Europe for 3 centuries. It also produced a social system designed to process the wealth those raids generated, including the human wealth that often proved most valuable of all. The Thrall system was slavery, but slavery with characteristics specific to Norse culture. Thralls were property, owned completely by their masters, with no rights that their owners were obligated to respect. They could be bought, sold, gifted, punished, used, and disposed of according to owner preference. The children of thralls were born into thralldom regardless of paternity, creating a hereditary servant class that expanded with each generation. But within this system, distinctions existed that made certain thralls far more valuable than others. The Norse recognized that captives brought different qualities depending on their origins. A peasant farmer, taken during a raid, might be strong enough for agricultural labor, but lacked the education, refinement, and prestige that certain household functions required. A noble woman, however, brought capabilities that common captives did not possess: literacy, cultural knowledge, social graces, the ability to manage complex households, and something else that the Norse valued perhaps above all: status. Viking society was intensely hierarchical, with status determining everything from seating arrangements at feasts to the quality of burial goods that accompanied the dead to the afterlife. Wealth was a component of status, but not its totality. What truly elevated a man in Norse society was reputation, demonstrated excellence, visible proof of worth that others could observe and acknowledge. And nothing demonstrated worth more clearly than possessing what others could not obtain. A Jarl who owned a captured queen possessed something that his rivals did not. Every time she appeared in his hall, every time she served at his feasts, every time she was displayed before visitors, she advertised his power, his success, his superiority over the men whose kingdoms had provided such prizes. She was a living trophy, a permanent reminder of victories won, a status symbol that never depreciated because her value came not from what she could do but from what she represented. This is why captured royalty was treated differently than common thralls. Common thralls were economic resources, their value measured in labor output. Royal thralls were status resources, their value measured in the prestige their possession conferred. A Jarl might own dozens of common thralls and consider them interchangeable. A single captured queen was unique, irreplaceable, a prize whose loss would diminish his reputation. But status was not the only value that royal captives provided. The Norse religion was transactional. The gods, Odin, Thor, Freyr, Freya, and the rest, were not abstract moral authorities, but powerful beings who could be bargained with, appeased, manipulated. Proper sacrifices brought divine favor. Neglecting the gods brought disaster. The relationship was commercial. Humans provided offerings. Gods provided benefits. The quality of offerings mattered. Animal sacrifices were common, appropriate for everyday requests and minor blessings, but significant undertakings required significant offerings. A major military campaign, a dangerous sea voyage, a new settlement in hostile territory, these required sacrifices proportional to what was being asked. And the highest quality sacrifice was human. The blot, the Norse sacrificial ritual, included provisions for human offerings in circumstances that warranted them. The sources are explicit about this, despite later efforts to minimize or reinterpret what they describe. Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, described the temple at Uppsala where human bodies hung alongside animals in a sacred grove. The sagas reference blood offerings that clearly involved people, not just livestock. What the sources are less explicit about, but what the archaeological evidence increasingly suggests, is the specific role that high-status captives played in these rituals. A common thrall, sacrificed to the gods, was acceptable for ordinary purposes, but a queen, A princess? A woman whose blood carried the prestige of kingdoms, whose death would have consequences in the political world, whose sacrifice demonstrated the wealth and power of those who could afford to destroy such valuable property. That was an offering the gods would notice. This is the context in which Matilda was claimed by the man with the braided beard. When he said, Freya Gafur, Freya gives, he was not making casual conversation. He was invoking a goddess, marking Matilda as a specific type of prize, signaling to his men that she was not merely plunder to be divided, but a sacred acquisition with ritual significance. She did not know this, as she was led to the ships. She knew only that she had been taken, that everything she loved was dead or burning, that she was property now, in a way that her status as queen had never prepared her to understand. She would learn what Freya Gefur meant. She would learn what her new owners considered appropriate uses for a woman of her birth and beauty. She would learn that there were fates worse than death, and that some of them were considered honors by the men who imposed them. The journey took 17 days. 17 days of sailing through waters that seemed designed to punish, waves that sent even experienced warriors staggering, winds that shifted without warning from favorable to murderous. Matilda spent most of it below decks in a space not designed for passengers, surrounded by other captives, whose faces she learned to recognize in the darkness. There were 31 women in the hold. She counted them during the first calm period, when enough light filtered through the deck planks to see. 26 were commoners, servants and farmers' wives, and craftsmen's daughters taken during the raid. 5 were noble, though none as highly ranked as Matilda herself. 2 were daughters of thangs who had served her husband. 2 were widows of minor lords who had died in the battle. 1 was a young woman whose precise status Matilda never determined, but whose clothing and bearing suggested education and refinement. The commoners were treated roughly, fed minimally, watered barely adequately, handled by the crew with the casual cruelty that property receives when its damage does not significantly affect its value. Several were used during the voyage in ways that Matilda could hear through the thin walls of the storage space where the noble captives were kept separately. The noble women were treated differently, not well, not with kindness, but with a care that reflected their status as valuable property. They received better food, more water, protection from the crew. The man with the braided beard, whose name Matilda eventually learned was Sigurd Jarnsitha, Sigurd Ironside, visited them daily to ensure they remained healthy, examining them with the same assessing gaze he had turned on her in the burning hall. He spoke to Matilda during these visits, using broken Saxon that he must have learned during previous raids. His vocabulary was limited, but sufficient to communicate essential information. You, queen, value, he said during the first visit. Others, less. You, special. What will happen to us? She asked. The first words she had spoken since her capture. Thing, decide. The word meant nothing to her then. Later, she would learn that thing referred to the assembly where Norse freemen gathered to make collective decisions, including decisions about the division of valuable plunder. And if I resist? If I refuse to cooperate? Sigurd studied her with something that might have been respect. You see husband. You see men. You know what? She did know. She had watched Oswulf die. She had watched his warriors die. She understood what resistance meant. Not freedom, but prolonged suffering, followed by the same ultimate outcome. I cooperate, she said. Good. You smart. Smart live longer. He left her with that cold comfort, the assurance that intelligence might extend her survival without any guarantee about the quality of that survival. The other noble women asked her what he had said. She told them, watching their faces as they processed the same calculations she had already made. Resistance was suicide. Cooperation was surrender. Neither option offered hope, only different paths through hopelessness. The young woman, whose status she couldn't determine, who gave her name as Edgith, asked the question that none of the others dared voice. "What do you think they'll do to us?" Matilda considered lying, considered offering false comfort, the kind of reassurance that leaders were supposed to provide to those who followed them. But she was not a leader anymore. She was property. And property had no obligation to protect its fellow property from truth. "I don't know," she said. "I've heard stories. Raids that took women and were never seen again. Tales that traders brought back from the north. But they were stories. They might have been exaggerated. And if they weren't, then we'll learn what wasn't exaggerated. And we'll survive it if we can." Edgith nodded slowly, accepting the answer despite its inadequacy. The other women listened in silence, each making her own peace with uncertainty in her own way. The ship sailed on, carrying them toward a land where their status as noblewomen would determine not whether they suffered, but how. The harbor where they landed was larger than Matilda expected, a natural bay surrounded by hills that provided shelter from winds while allowing easy access to the sea. Ships filled the water, dozens of them, ranging from small fishing boats to massive warships that dwarfed the vessel she had arrived on. The shore was crowded with buildings, wooden structures that seemed chaotic to her eyes accustomed to the ordered layouts of Christian settlements, sprawling and organic and alive with activity. This was Kaupang, she would later learn, one of the great trading centers of the Viking world, a place where goods from across the known world, and humans from across the known world, changed hands according to the rhythms of supply and demand. The captives were unloaded with efficiency that spoke of long practice. The common women were taken one direction, toward a large building near the shore that Matilda would later learn was the Thrall market, where captured humans were bought and sold like livestock. The noble women were taken another direction, toward a complex of buildings set apart from the main settlement, surrounded by a wooden palisade that suggested both protection and containment. Sigurd walked beside Matilda during this journey, his hand occasionally touching her arm to guide her through the crowd, his presence marking her as his property, his claim. Other men looked at her with interest, some calling out words she didn't understand, but none approached. Sigurd's reputation, whatever it was, provided protection that his physical presence alone could not have guaranteed. The complex inside the palisade contained several buildings organized around a central courtyard. Women moved through this space, some Norse by their appearance, others clearly foreign, a mixture of ages and origins that suggested this place had been receiving captives for a long time. An older woman approached as they entered, her hair gray beneath a simple head covering, her bearing suggesting authority, despite the absence of obvious markers of status. She spoke to Sigurd in rapid Norse, her tone businesslike, her gaze assessing Matilda with professional detachment. Sigurd responded at length, gesturing at Matilda several times, using words she couldn't understand. The older woman's expression changed as she listened, moving from professional interest to something more intense. "Drottning?" she said, looking at Matilda directly. "Vera Drottning?" "Yes," Matilda said, understanding the question if not the language. "I am a queen. I was a queen." The older woman nodded slowly, then spoke to Sigurd again. Her tone had changed, become almost deferential. Whatever Sigurd had told her had elevated Matilda's status even here, even as a captive, even as property. Sigurd left without ceremony, entrusting Matilda to the older woman's care. The other noble captives were similarly transferred, each assigned to different attendants, scattered through the complex according to some system Matilda couldn't discern. The older woman, who gave her name as Thora, led Matilda to a small building at the rear of the complex. Inside was a single room, simple but clean, with a bed, a chest, a basin for washing. It was better accommodation than Matilda had expected. It was also clearly a cell, a place of confinement despite its relative comfort. "You stay," Thora said, in halting Saxon. "Eat. Rest. Clean. 3 days. What happens in 3 days? Thing. Men decide. Your fate. She left before Matilda could ask more questions, closing the door behind her. The sound of a bar being placed across the outside confirmed what Matilda already knew. This comfortable room was a prison, and she was a prisoner awaiting judgment. She sat on the bed, alone for the first time since the burning hall, and allowed herself to feel what she had been suppressing since her capture. Fear, grief, rage, despair. The emotions moved through her like weather, each one intense, and then fading into the next, a storm that had been building for 17 days, finally breaking. She cried for Oswulf, for her children, for the kingdom she had lost. She cried for herself, for the future she could not imagine, for the fate that awaited her at this thing that would decide how she would be used. She cried until she had no tears left, until her body was empty of everything except the fundamental determination to survive that had brought her this far. Then she washed her face, ate the food that had been left for her, and began to plan. She did not know what options existed. She did not know what the Norse would permit or forbid, but she knew that she was still alive, still thinking, still capable of observation and calculation. While those things remained true, she was not helpless. 3 days. She had 3 days to learn what she could, to understand the system she was now trapped within, to find any leverage that might influence the outcome of decisions being made about her life. She began by examining her cell, searching for anything that might be useful, any weakness in the confinement that might be exploited. She found nothing. The room was secure, designed by people who understood how captives thought. So she waited. She watched. She listened to sounds filtering through the walls, voices and footsteps, and fragments of activity that told her about the complex she was imprisoned in. She noted the schedule of her guards, the timing of meals, the patterns of movement that governed this place. And she thought about what she had heard before her capture, about what Vikings did to high-status women, stories that traders and survivors had brought back, whispers that noble ladies shared when they thought servants weren't listening, tales that might have been exaggerated or might have been understatements, she no longer knew which. She would learn which stories were true soon enough. The thing convened on the morning of the 4th day, in a natural amphitheater a short walk from the trading settlement. Matilda was brought there, along with the other noble captives, all of them cleaned and dressed in Norse clothing that felt foreign against her skin, their hair arranged in styles that marked them as outsiders despite the attempt at assimilation. The assembly was larger than she expected. Hundreds of men, seated on the slopes of the amphitheater or standing in clusters throughout the space, their voices creating a constant hum of conversation that fell silent when the proceedings began. Women were present too, standing at the edges of a gathering, watching with interest that suggested this was significant entertainment as well as serious business. Sigurd stood at the center of the assembly, along with several other men whose bearing suggested comparable status. Chiefs, she assumed. Jarls. The men who had led the raid and who now sought recognition for their achievements. A man older than the others, his hair pure white, and his face weathered by decades of northern living, stood and began to speak. His voice was strong despite his age, carrying across the assembly with practiced authority. He spoke for several minutes, his words occasionally prompting reactions from the gathered men, laughter or murmurs of approval or sounds of disagreement. Matilda understood none of it. She stood with the other captives, watching faces she couldn't read, discuss her fate in words she couldn't comprehend. She felt like an object being appraised at auction, which was, she realized, exactly what she was. Sigurd spoke when the old man finished, his words accompanied by gestures toward the captives, toward the horizon, toward the assembled warriors who had participated in the raid. He was recounting the battle, she understood, telling the story of victory establishing the context for the division of spoils. Other men spoke after him, some supporting his account, others adding details or disputing specific points. The assembly functioned like a court, she realized, with testimony and argumentation and some form of judgment being rendered. What she could not determine was what outcome that judgment would produce. When the speaking finally ended, the old man stood again and made pronouncements that produced various reactions throughout the assembly. Some men cheered. Others looked disappointed. A few argued briefly before subsiding into acceptance. Then he gestured toward the captives, and the tone of the assembly changed. Men began approaching the area where Matilda and the others stood. They examined the captives openly, touching faces and arms and hair, asking questions that the women couldn't answer. This was the inspection that preceded distribution, she understood. The judgment of quality that would determine value. The common captives who had been held separately were brought forward and divided quickly, assigned to various men according to some formula Matilda couldn't follow. They were led away without ceremony, absorbed into households where their labor would serve whatever purposes their new owners required. The noble captives received different treatment. The old man spoke at length about them, his words producing respectful attention from the assembly. He pointed to each woman in turn, saying something that caused men to nod or murmur among themselves. When he pointed to Matilda, his tone changed, became more emphatic, and the assembly's reaction was notably stronger. Sigurd stepped forward and spoke. The word he had used in the burning hall, Freya Gafur, appeared in his speech, and its effect on the assembly was visible. Men grew quiet. Some made gestures that might have been religious, touching amulets or making signs Matilda didn't recognize. The old man asked something that sounded like a question. Sigurd answered. More questions followed, each producing answers that seemed to satisfy the assembly, but that told Matilda nothing about what was being decided. Finally, the old man made a pronouncement that was clearly definitive. The assembly responded with sounds of approval, and men began dispersing. The formal proceedings apparently concluded. Sigurd approached Matilda with an expression she couldn't interpret. "Thing decide," he said. "You mine. 3 months. Then what?" He hesitated, searching for words in her language. "Freya's house. Ritual. Great honor." "What kind of ritual?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he took her arm and began leading her away from the assembly, toward the harbor, toward a ship that was being prepared for departure. 3 months, he repeated. "You learn, you understand, then you know." She did not find this reassuring. Sigurd's home was not in Kaupang, but on an island several days sailing to the north, a place called Hrafnzer, Raven Island, where his household occupied a complex of buildings, overlooking a fjord of staggering beauty. Mountains rose directly from the water, their peaks still white with snow despite the advancing season. The water itself was so clear that Matilda could see fish moving far below the surface. The air smelled of salt and pine and something else, something clean and cold that had no equivalent in her homeland. Under different circumstances, she might have found it beautiful. Under current circumstances, she found it terrifying, a place so remote that escape was inconceivable, surrounded by water and wilderness that would kill her more surely than any human pursuit. Sigurd's household was larger than she expected. His wife, a stern woman named Helga, managed an establishment that included numerous thralls, freeborn servants, warriors who owed Sigurd allegiance, and various family members whose precise relationships Matilda never fully understood. It was a community unto itself, dependent on the outside world for trade goods, but otherwise self-sufficient, capable of surviving independently through the long northern winters. Matilda's position within this household was ambiguous. She was not treated as a common thrall, not assigned to labor alongside the other captives who worked Sigurd's fields and maintained his buildings. But she was not treated as a guest either, not free to move about as she wished or to make decisions about her own activities. She occupied some middle space, a valuable possession being preserved for a specific purpose. The purpose became clearer as weeks passed, and she learned more of the language, more of the culture, more of the system she was embedded within. Sigurd had claimed her under the invocation of Freya, the goddess of love, fertility, beauty, and war. This invocation had specific implications that the assembly at Kaupang had recognized and approved. Matilda was not merely Sigurd's property. She was a dedicated offering, a living sacrifice, whose ultimate disposition would be determined by ritual requirements rather than commercial calculation. The 3 months Sigurd had mentioned were a preparation period. During this time, Matilda was to be taught the practices of Freya's worship, to learn the goddess's myths and rituals, to be transformed from a foreign queen into an appropriate vessel for sacred purposes. The teaching was conducted by a woman named Valdis, a Velva, a seeress, who served as Sigurd's household religious specialist. Valdis was old in the way that certain powerful women become old, not weakened by age, but concentrated by it, her eyes holding knowledge that Matilda could not begin to comprehend. She spoke fluent Saxon, learned during years of traveling across the regions where Vikings raided and traded. "You are honored," Valdis told her during their first formal meeting. "You do not understand this yet, but you will. Freyja has chosen you through Sigurd's hand. What awaits you is not punishment, but elevation." "What exactly awaits me?" Valdis smiled, an expression that contained no warmth. "That depends on many things: your behavior during preparation, the signs that the goddess sends, the needs of the community when the time comes. But I will tell you what I can tell you, so that you understand your position." She explained, in detail, that left nothing to imagination, the role that high-status captives played in Norse religious practice. Freyja was associated with a practice called Seithur, a form of shamanic ritual that involved altered states of consciousness, communication with spirits, and the working of fate itself. Practitioners of Seithur, predominantly women, served as intermediaries between the human and divine realms, their abilities valued and feared in equal measure. The most powerful Seithur rituals required specific components. Among these components were human participants whose status enhanced the ritual's effectiveness. A queen, a woman who had ruled over others, who carried the spiritual weight of sovereignty, possessed qualities that ordinary women did not. Her participation in certain rituals amplified their power in ways that Norse practitioners considered essential for the most significant workings. "Participation," Matilda said carefully. "What does participation involve?" Valdis did not answer immediately. Instead, she described the categories of ritual involvement that Freya's worship encompassed. The first category was service. Queens and noblewomen might serve as handmaidens in temple complexes, their presence honoring the goddess while their labor maintained sacred spaces. This was the lightest fate, the outcome that allowed captives to retain some dignity while fulfilling their religious function. The second category was dedication. Women might be consecrated as permanent servants of the goddess, their bodies and their lives, committed to sacred purposes that included various forms of ritual participation. This fate was more demanding, but still allowed continued existence. The third category was marriage. Freya, like other Norse deities, maintained a spiritual household that required attendance. Women might be given to the goddess as brides, their human lives ending so that their spiritual existence could begin in Freyja's realm. This fate was considered the highest honor, reserved for captives of exceptional status and beauty. Matilda understood what Valdis was delicately avoiding, saying, "The third category was human sacrifice, dressed in religious language that made murder into devotion. Which category has been decided for me? That is not yet determined. The signs must be read. Your preparation must be completed. The goddess herself will indicate her preference through omens that I am trained to interpret. And if I refuse, if I resist this process, Valdez's smile faded. Then the preparation fails, and Sigurd's claim on you is invalidated. You would be returned to the common thrall pool, sold to whoever offered sufficient price, used for whatever purposes your new owner preferred. There would be no honor in that fate, no meaning. Only the slow degradation that awaits ordinary captives. The choice was not between freedom and bondage. It was between different forms of bondage, between religious significance and commercial use, between a death that carried meaning and a life that carried none. I will cooperate with the preparation, Matilda said. I will learn what you teach, but I will not pretend to believe things I do not believe. Belief is not required, only participation. The goddess judges actions, not thoughts. She will read your heart when the time comes. Until then, you need only do what you are told. The preparation began that same day. The preparation was comprehensive, designed to transform Matilda from a foreign Christian queen into something that could appropriately participate in Norse sacred practice. It involved education in mythology, instruction in ritual procedures, and physical preparations that she found increasingly disturbing as the weeks progressed. The education was almost welcome. Matilda had always possessed an active mind, and learning provided something to focus on besides fear and grief. She studied the Norse cosmos, the 9 worlds connected by the great tree Yggdrasil, the gods and their relationships, the prophecy of Ragnarok that foretold the end of all things. She learned that Freyja was not merely a goddess of beauty and love, but a powerful deity who commanded half the slain warriors, who practiced the most potent forms of magic, who had sacrificed her own dignity to obtain gifts she considered essential. The story of Freyja and the Brisingamen necklace was told to her repeatedly, a tale in which the goddess obtained a magnificent piece of jewelry by spending one night with each of the 4 dwarves who had crafted it. The story was meant to illustrate Freyja's willingness to use all available means to achieve her goals, her understanding that desire could be a tool as well as an experience. She was not degraded by this, Valdez explained. She was empowered. She obtained what she wanted by offering what others wanted. This is wisdom, not shame. Matilda understood the lesson she was being taught. Submission could be reframed as strategy. Violation could be reimagined as transaction. If you told yourself the right story, anything could become bearable. She learned the stories. She did not believe them. The ritual instruction was more difficult. Matilda was taught the procedures of Seidr practice, the chants and movements that induced altered states, the techniques for opening consciousness to spiritual influence. She learned how Velvas entered trance states, how they communicated with spirits, how they returned to ordinary awareness with knowledge gained from other realms. The practice sessions were physically demanding and psychologically destabilizing. The chanting produced strange effects, vibrations in her chest and head that made ordinary perception unreliable. The fasting that accompanied certain practices left her weakened and suggestible. The isolation that followed intense sessions broke down her sense of self in ways she found terrifying. She began seeing things during these sessions, faces in shadows, figures at the edge of vision that disappeared when she looked directly at them. Once she was certain she saw Oswulf, his face as it had been before the battle, watching her from across the room where she practiced alone. She knew these visions were products of the techniques being used on her, that her mind was being manipulated through physical stress and psychological pressure. But knowing this did not make the visions less real when they occurred. She was losing control of her own perception, and she did not know how to stop it. The physical preparations were the worst. Her body was being transformed according to standards she did not set. She was fed specific foods meant to enhance certain qualities. She was bathed in water infused with herbs whose effects she could not identify. She was tattooed with symbols, small marks on her shoulders, and back that Valdez said were dedication marks, signs that she belonged to Freyja's service. And she was trained in practices that she had never imagined, would never have imagined, before her capture. Freyja's rituals involve the body, Valdez explained matter-of-factly. The goddess's power flows through physical expression. You must learn to channel this power, to become a vessel through which divine energy moves. This requires training that your Christian upbringing did not provide. The training was conducted by women, at least, not by the men whose interest Matilda feared. But it was training nonetheless. Systematic instruction in forms of physical engagement that her previous life had not prepared her to discuss, much less perform. She learned what was expected of women who participated in certain rituals. She learned what Freyja's worship involved in its most intense expressions. She learned that her body was no longer her own, that it had become a ritual instrument to be played according to the goddess's requirements. She cooperated. She had no choice. And slowly, despite her resistance, she began to change. The change was not belief. Matilda never accepted the Norse gods as real, never truly thought that Freyja was watching her preparation, or would judge her participation in coming rituals. Her Christian faith, shaken by her experiences, remained the framework through which she understood the world. But the change was real nonetheless. The practices she was learning, the techniques for altering consciousness, the physical training that broke down her inhibitions, all of it transformed her relationship with her own body and mind. She became capable of things she would not have believed possible. She could enter trance states deliberately, could experience visions that felt more real than ordinary reality, could separate her awareness from her physical sensations in ways that made even the most difficult experiences bearable. She became, without intending to, an effective practitioner of Seidr. Valdez noticed this development with satisfaction that was almost maternal. "You have the gift," she told Matilda, after a particularly intense session. "Some women can learn the techniques but never truly master them. Their minds resist, their bodies refuse. But you open. You allow the power to move through you. This is rare. I allow nothing. I simply do what I am forced to do. The distinction matters less than you think. Power does not care whether it is welcomed or merely accepted. It flows through whoever provides a channel. You provide an excellent channel." "And what does that mean for my fate?" Valdez considered the question carefully before answering. "It means you have become more valuable than Sigurd initially understood. A queen is a significant offering. A queen who is also a natural practitioner is something more. The goddess will surely claim you for the highest service. The highest service, marriage to Freyja. The sacrifice that ended human life and began whatever existence awaited in the goddess's realm." Matilda should have been terrified. In some way she was. But the training had done something to her fear, had transformed it into something colder and more manageable. She could contemplate her own death with the same detachment she had learned to apply to the sessions that had seemed unbearable when they began. "When?" she asked. "The great ritual takes place at the winter solstice. The longest night, the darkest time. That is when the boundary between worlds is thinnest, when offerings can most easily cross from human existence to divine presence. You have 6 weeks remaining. 6 weeks, 42 days, perhaps 1,000 hours before she would be killed in a ritual she did not believe in, by people whose gods she rejected, for purposes that meant nothing to her understanding of existence. She had 6 weeks to find an alternative. The alternative came from an unexpected direction. Helga, Sigurd's wife, who had watched Matilda's preparation with an attention that Matilda had initially interpreted as suspicion or hostility. She was wrong about Helga's feelings. "You are clever," Helga said to her one evening, speaking in Norse that Matilda had become fluent enough to understand. "Cleverer than the others who have passed through this house. Most captive queens are broken by now. You are not broken. You have found a way to survive inside yourself. I have cooperated with everything demanded of me. Cooperation is not the same as surrender. I see the difference. I have watched many women in your position. Most lose themselves before the ritual claims them. You have not. What are you suggesting? Helga glanced around to ensure they were alone. The conversation was dangerous, Matilda understood. Whatever Helga was about to propose went beyond what was permitted. Sigurd values you as an offering to Freya, but I value other things. I have seen what you are capable of. I have watched you learn our ways with a speed that impresses even Valdis. You could be more than a sacrifice. You could be useful. Useful how? This household needs a Volva of its own. Valdis is old. She will not live many more years. When she dies, we will need someone to read omens, to communicate with spirits, to perform the rituals that keep our family prosperous and protected. You could be that person. I am a captive, a thrall. Thralls can be freed. Status can be changed. If I speak for you, if I convince Sigurd that your value as a living practitioner exceeds your value as a dead offering, your fate changes. Why would you do this? Helga's expression became complex, layered with emotions that Matilda couldn't fully read. Because I was a captive once, before I was Sigurd's wife. I was taken from my home in a raid, brought here, prepared for purposes similar to what awaits you. I found a way to survive. I have never forgotten what it felt like to face what you are facing. And you have the power to change Sigurd's mind? I have influence. I have given him children, managed his household, proven my value in ways that create obligations. He listens to me. He does not always agree, but he listens. What would you want in return? Your loyalty, your service, your skills applied to this household's benefit, rather than wasted on a single ritual that will be forgotten within a year. I want you to become what I was not able to become. A Velva in your own right, serving this family across decades, rather than dying to impress visitors at a solstice festival. Matilda considered the offer. It was not freedom. It was a different form of bondage, permanent service rather than terminal sacrifice. But permanent service allowed continued existence, and continued existence allowed hope, however faint, of eventual escape or rescue or circumstances, changing in ways she could not predict. I accept, she said. I will speak to Sigurd. I cannot guarantee the outcome, but I will try. Helga left, and Matilda was alone with hope for the first time since her capture. The negotiation took 3 weeks. Sigurd was not easily convinced. He had invested considerable reputation in claiming Matilda under Freya's invocation. Changing her fate would require explanation to the community, acknowledgement that his initial intention had shifted, acceptance of diminished status for the offering he had promised. These were not small costs in a society where reputation determined everything, Helga argued. She brought Valdis into the discussion, and Valdis, surprisingly, supported the alternative. Matilda's abilities as a practitioner were genuine, Valdis confirmed. Training someone with her natural gifts to replace herself would serve the household better than a single impressive sacrifice. Sigurd resisted. He consulted with other jarls, sought opinions from religious authorities, struggled with the decision in ways that Matilda could observe but not influence. 3 days before the solstice, he made his decision. You will not be sacrificed, he told Matilda, his tone suggesting that he was not entirely happy with this outcome, but had accepted its necessity. You will instead be dedicated to Freyja's service as a Velva of this household. You will serve the goddess through practice rather than death. You will live. Thank you. Do not thank me. Thank my wife, whose arguments proved more persuasive than my own preferences. And understand what this means. You are not freed. You are not a guest. You are a dedicated servant of the goddess, bound to this household service for the remainder of your life. You will practice seether when required. You will read omens when asked. You will serve Freya's purposes through living service rather than dying sacrifice. I understand. I hope you do. Because the alternative remains available if you fail to fulfill your function. The goddess can always claim you later if you prove unsuitable for continued service. He left, and Matilda understood that she had not escaped. She had negotiated a different form of captivity, one that allowed her to breathe and think and exist, but captivity nonetheless. It was enough. For now. The years that followed were not what Matilda had imagined any life could be. She became, against all expectation, genuinely skilled at the practices she had been forced to learn. The seether techniques that had been imposed on her as preparation for sacrifice became tools she used with increasing sophistication. She learned to read omens with accuracy that impressed even Valdez. She learned to communicate with what the Norse called spirits, experiences that she could not explain within her Christian framework but could not deny either. She served Sigurd's household for 7 years before Valdez died, and she became the primary Velva. She served another 12 years after that, her reputation growing until other households sought her counsel, until Jarls traveled to Hrafnzair, specifically to consult with the foreign seeress whose insights had proven reliable. She never forgot that she was a captive. She never stopped hoping for freedom. But she learned to find meaning within the constraints she could not escape, to build a life within the boundaries others had set. She learned, most strangely of all, to love some of the people who held her captive. Helga became something like a friend, the only person in Sigurd's household who understood what Matilda had experienced and what she had overcome. They talked often, sharing perspectives that neither could have gained alone, building a connection that transcended the categories of free and thrall. She even developed respect for Sigurd, who proved to be a more complex man than his raid commander persona suggested. He was brutal by necessity, she came to understand, a product of a culture that required brutality for survival. But within the constraints of his world, he treated those under his protection with something approaching fairness. He listened to advice. He learned from mistakes. He was capable of changing his mind when evidence warranted. She had children during these years. 2 sons and a daughter, fathered by a free-born Norse warrior whom Sigurd selected for her because he believed the combination of bloodlines would produce exceptional offspring. The relationship was not love, not initially, but it became something, a partnership that allowed both parties to find what comfort existed within their circumstances. Her children were born free, their father's status overriding her own in this matter of status inheritance. They grew up knowing their mother was a thrall, but also a Velva, a woman of considerable power despite her technical bondage. They learned both Norse ways and the Christian traditions she taught them privately, becoming bridges between worlds that their existence connected. She never escaped. She never returned to her homeland. She never learned what happened to her children from her first marriage, the ones she had left behind in the burning palace. She carried that grief until her death, a wound that never healed despite everything else she learned to accept. But she survived. She found meaning. She built a life from the ruins of the one that was destroyed. And she remembered everything. Matilda died at 63, old for her era, her body worn by decades of demanding practice and harsh northern winters. She died in the house where she had lived for 32 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren who mourned her passing with genuine grief. She was buried according to Norse custom, despite her private Christian faith, because that was what her community expected, and because she had long since stopped caring about the forms of religion. Her grave goods included the tools of her practice, drums and staffs, and the iron rattle that she had used to enter trance states. They included jewelry she had accumulated over years of service, gifts from those who had valued her counsel. They included, at her specific request, a small Christian cross that she had hidden throughout her captivity, the only physical remnant of her previous life. The grave was marked with a stone that bore both Norse runes and Latin letters, a monument to a woman who had lived between worlds and found a way to bridge them. Her story survived through oral tradition, passed down through generations of the family she had served. It became part of the household's history, the tale of the foreign queen who had been captured and nearly sacrificed, and instead became a Velva of exceptional power. The story changed with each telling, as stories do, gaining embellishments and losing details, until the historical Matilda was barely recognizable in the legendary figure she became. But the core of the story remained: a woman taken from her home, stripped of everything she had been, who found a way not just to survive but to matter within the world that had conquered her. The fate Matilda experienced was not typical. She was lucky in ways that most captured queens were not. The historical and archaeological evidence suggests that the majority of high-status captives met the end that Matilda narrowly avoided. They were sacrificed in rituals that the Norse considered honors, but that the victims almost certainly experienced as murder. They were used in ceremonies that modern sensibilities cannot contemplate without revulsion. They disappeared into a system that valued them for their status, precisely because destroying that status demonstrated the power of those who destroyed it. The sagas contain hints of these fates, references to bed slaves of noble blood and offerings of royal quality that scholars have traditionally interpreted as metaphors or exaggerations. But the archaeological evidence increasingly suggests these references were literal. The Oseberg ship burial, one of the most spectacular Viking Age discoveries ever made, contained the remains of 2 women buried with extraordinary wealth and ceremony. One of these women was clearly of high status, buried with honor and respect. The other showed signs of having been killed specifically for inclusion in the burial, a sacrifice to accompany the primary occupant into the afterlife. This pattern appears repeatedly in Viking Age graves. High-status women buried with attendants who did not choose their fate, whose presence in the grave reflected not their own achievements but their utility to those who survived them. Similar evidence appears at ritual sites throughout the Norse world. Human remains that show signs of ritual killing, bones of individuals who clearly came from different populations than the communities that buried them. Physical evidence of the practices that the sagas describe in carefully euphemistic language. The Vikings did not invent human sacrifice. They did not invent the taking and using of captives. But they developed these practices with a systematic attention that made them exceptionally effective at processing human beings for various purposes, including purposes that modern observers find almost impossible to comprehend. The captured queens who passed through their hands experienced fates that ranged from the relatively fortunate, like Matilda's eventual accommodation, to the absolutely horrific death in rituals designed to honor gods who demanded the destruction of valuable things. They were valuable precisely because they could be destroyed. That was the logic of the system. That was what Viking society created and refined over centuries. That was what happened to the queens who fell into their hands. Remember Matilda. Remember the other noble captives whose names we do not know, whose stories were not preserved, whose fates we can only reconstruct from fragments and implications. Remember that the Vikings celebrated in popular culture the fierce warriors and bold explorers, the founders of settlements and traders of goods, were also this: slavers and killers, practitioners of human sacrifice, builders of a system designed to extract maximum value from human beings, including their deaths. Remember that civilization is not one thing. The same cultures that produced beautiful art and sophisticated shipbuilding and complex legal systems also produced horrors that we prefer not to examine closely. The Vikings were not exceptions to this rule. They were examples of it. Remember that survival, in circumstances designed to prevent it, is a form of victory. Matilda did not escape her captivity. She did not overthrow the system that held her. She did not achieve the freedom that she deserved as a human being, but she survived. She found meaning. She built something from the nothing that remained after everything was taken. That is not enough. It should not have to be enough, but it is what was possible, and she made it work, and her story survived to remind us of realities that comfortable histories prefer to forget. Remember what Vikings really did to captured queens. Remember that it happened to real women, not characters in sagas, not figures in legends, but human beings who experienced what we can only read about. Remember them. Subscribe if you want more histories that look at the past without the filters of adventure and romance. Comment below telling me where you are watching from. Share this video with anyone who thinks they understand the Vikings from television shows that focus on drama rather than reality. Because the reality was Matilda, standing in a burning hall, watching her husband die, being led to a ship that would carry her to a future she could not imagine. Because the reality was choices between different forms of destruction, negotiations for survival that should never have been necessary, accommodations to horror that no person should have to make. Because the reality was worse than death, and also, somehow, the possibility of life, despite everything. Remember,